Hey guys, I'm coming to you again to talk about World War One, and right now we're going to talk about how it changed America at home. So, America at War, the home front. World War One, not everybody was super excited about getting involved in. If you remember, Americans wanted to stay largely neutral until 1917, when Woodrow Wilson really felt like we had to go help those allied powers out, especially as unrestricted warfare was rolling out and Russia had pulled out of the war and they had just lost a major allied power. And so there was a lot of opposition to the war. This was a very complex, complicated war. A lot of Americans didn't understand what was really happening over in Europe. There was just so many things that had gone on and alliances and so forth. So a lot of people didn't understand it. We also had a lot of ethnic groups living in America that belonged to those central powers. And so, there was a fear of those people maybe not supporting the war effort, those connections to those people, having those roots back home, and that maybe it just wasn't our business. Maybe this was all just about making money and so forth. So we did have a large number of pacifists. We had a lot of what were called conscientious objectors in World War One. People that just said they didn't believe in fighting, they didn't believe in war. People that said they were not going to be drafted, and that tried to resist that whole process. So this was a war that a lot of people were not enthused about, that did not want to get involved in. Definitely was a war that kind of divided people a little bit here in America. But when it came to making sure that we could carry out this war effort, the president did have to make sure that, despite the fact that not everybody was on board, we had to make sure that things were going to work. So, presidential powers typically always increase during times of war. We've seen this when we talked about Lincoln during the Civil War, when we've seen some other wars. And so, once again, in World War One, President Wilson's power is going to increase. And one of the biggest ways that Wilson's power is going to increase is by taking over the economy. Presidential powers are going to be used basically to mobilize the economy to support the war effort. Remember, we just talked about the fact that we are the number one food supplier for the Allies throughout the entire war. We're lending a ton of weapons. We're lending a ton of money. We're really the number one, supplier of troops that last year, bringing in that final wave when the AEF comes in. So we've got to make sure that we are rolling with everything that we're supplying, everything overseas, the allies, our troops, and then also making sure Americans are still taken care of here at home. So the president's going to take over the economy by introducing a number of industries. One of the most important ones is something called the War Industries Board, the WIB. That basically means that the government comes in and it takes command of the factories. So the government's going to come in and basically they tell the factories what they are producing. They take control over what they're producing, how much they're producing, so the factories can produce things for the war effort. They're also going to set up something called the War Labor Board. The last thing we want is our workers going on strike in the middle of trying to produce things for a war effort. So now we have a government agency to settle labor disputes during this time. We're still coming out of that cusp of the age of industry. We've, of course, had the progressive era, but not a whole lot has changed for a lot of our workers. So we want to make sure that our workers are not going on strike. Government's going to take over the railroad with the Railroad Administration to make sure that goods are shipped back and forth to the ports so that they can get shipped overseas. They're going to also set up something called the Shipping Board. The Shipping Board is going to set up a merchant marine. The entire job of the merchant marine is to ship goods overseas. It's not part of the actual military, but it is run by the government to make sure that troops overseas are getting those supplies. Very, very dangerous job. Because you don't have a lot of protection. Typical merchant marine ship only has one big gun on it. And at this time, they're pretty much being sent out completely unprotected to try to get stuff into war zones. If you ever get a chance to go down to the port of Tampa when we're no longer quarantined and self-isolating, we have a amazing merchant marine ship that was used in World War II and the Vietnam War sitting right in the port of Tampa, the American Victory ship, sitting right by where the cruises go out, and you can pay, I think it's like $5 to go do a tour of it. It's pretty cool to go see, and there's a ton of like museum type artifacts and so forth in there. Government will take over and create something called the Food Administration. Again, we're the number one supplier of food throughout the entire war effort. Future President future President Hoover is going to be in charge of the Food Administration and then later become president. And we also are going to set up something called the Fuel Administration to conserve fuel, because obviously we need that for things like ships and tanks and the equipment that we're using as we are sending troops overseas and helping the Allies prior to that. We also are going to set up something called the Committee on Public Information, the CPI. The Committee on Public Information is basically how we're going to influence public opinion. We know that this war isn't particularly popular and we need people to support it, because when people do not support a war, that is when you end up losing a war. You only win a war when you have public support. So the Committee on Public Information is going to put out a lot of propaganda. This is the era where we start to see the Uncle Sam, we want you ads, encouraging every Iowa farm boy to join the military and do their patriotic duty and support the war effort. This is the era when we start to see lots of ads for people to come out and buy war bonds, because bonds are going to be a big way that we get money to be able to fund the war effort. We've talked about that in previous wars. Everybody being asked to kind of ration their goods and do without all of that propaganda. But we're also seeing a lot of anti-German propaganda at this time. The anti-German sentiment is running really, really high in America. So if I was a little handier with the computer, I'd be able to like post these, but I couldn't get my Zoom to record, so I'm just going to show you these. You get stuff like this: destroy the mad brute, right? Enlist in the military, and it depicts Germany as like this King Kong-ish beast. And the way you can always tell if it's anti-German is you look at the war helmets. They always have the little spike on top if they're German. H, I need you to stop making noise, please. Sorry. It was the dog before, now it's my 4-year-old. But, you know, if we don't enlist in the military, you know, our women are going to become brutalized by the savage, you know, beast of Germany. There's another really great one that I couldn't find, but I drew you a picture of what it looks like. It's not very great. I had one whiteboard that I grabbed from Freedom in my 1 hour that I had to go over there. But it's an upside-down German war helmet. You can tell, again, it's the spike. And hanging from the chin strap, it's like hanging like this. And there's plants growing out of it. And if you were actually to see the original one, it had writing on it. And it said, want to get yourself a new fern basket? Join the army and come get yourself one. Like, essentially, come kill yourself a German soldier and, like, bring this home as a memento. So there's all this anti-German sentiment that's being put out as propaganda as well. In fact, if we're talking about the anti-German sentiment, America went so far as to do things like ban German music. We weren't allowed to play, like, Bach. We started renaming German things. So instead of calling things like the German measles, we call them Liberty measles. Instead of German cabbage, we call it Liberty cabbage. Trying to think of some of the other ones that are kind of blanking on me right now. But we start changing all those things. We actually did the same thing right after September 11th when France refused to come help us fight terrorism. For a brief while, we were really angry at France. So we started calling like French fries, Liberty fries, and things like that. So we definitely went through this little phase in kind of modern history as well. You guys were too young to remember it, but there was a lot of anti-German sentiment during World War I. We also are very afraid of potential for spies in America with a lot of Germans and with some of the other ethnic groups that belong to the Central Powers living here amongst our immigrant population. So we do pass another Alien and Sedition Act during World War I, making it a little dangerous to speak out against the government. People had to be a little leery of that. So we have another one of those. If you speak out against the government, you can potentially be, you know, thrown in jail or fined or so forth. But we have a really important Supreme Court case that actually still impacts you guys today. It's a case called Schenck versus the United States. And in Schenck versus the United States, Schenck was a objector to the war. He did not agree with the war, and he especially didn't agree with the draft or conscription, the selective service. And so Schenck decided that he was going to start sending pamphlets out in the mail to all of these guys who were draft age. And so he sent out thousands, I want to say it was like, I don't know, 100,000 pamphlets or something crazy to all of these draft age males in America, basically telling them not to go register with the selective service, which is what the draft is. And it's your legal obligation when you're an 18-year-old male to register with the draft or the selective service. And he was basically saying, don't do it. And he was arrested for doing so. So he takes his case before the Supreme Court, and he argues, of course, hey, that's my First Amendment right. If I want to tell people not to register for the draft, that's my freedom of speech. So, welcome to my life, guys. I'm not always just a teacher. I can't do that, baby. Why don't you find another Play-Doh thing to play with? Sorry, guys. Have to wait for Schenck for just a moment. I'm trying my best. Go ask your sister if she can get it out, please. Or don't play with it. I can't right now. See if you can poke it out with a pen. You are messing up my video, and I can't edit this. All right, nope, Mommy can't fix it. Sorry. Okay, slight diversion there. Okay, so Shank sends out all of these pamphlets telling these guys not to register for the draft, goes before the Supreme Court when he's arrested, says, hey, that's my freedom of speech, First Amendment right. The Supreme Court takes a look at this, and this is where it actually still impacts you guys today, especially in the world of things like social media and the internet and so forth. The Supreme Court comes back and says, Shank is guilty. He is not allowed to do this. He's going to stay in jail and have his punishment and all that. And they do this on something called the Clear and Present Danger Clause. The Supreme Court actually says, you can pull up the majority opinion, that this is the equivalent to yelling fire in a crowded theater. That if you yell fire in a crowded theater, you're going to create a clear and present danger. People are going to panic, they're going to trample each other, people are going to get hurt. You cannot create a clear and present danger with your speech. So your freedom of speech is limited when you create a clear and present danger. Okay, so I say that this still impacts you guys today because you live in a world of internet and jumping on social media and posting things. If you say something that creates a clear and present danger, and this is where things like making threats towards school and making threats towards other people and so forth come in, you will not be protected under freedom of speech. That is even established all the way up to the Supreme Court. So Shank was not allowed to send his stuff out. This showed just how much the government was going to crack down on freedom of speech during this time of war, just how much public safety trumped this. The feeling was that by telling people to resist the draft, we were not going to have our troops protected overseas. We wouldn't have enough troops to protect them. We could lose the war. This would entirely endanger public safety. Okay, so the government definitely kind of takes this grip on everything in society during this war. Financing the war, bonds, liberty bonds, liberty bonds, liberty bonds, and of course taxes, providing manpower, Selective Service Act, conscription, draft. Those are all the same things, just 3 different ways of saying it. And the other thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about was opportunities for minorities. As we begin drafting troops and sending them overseas, we are going to have a lot of factory jobs opening up in the North for the very first time. And that means that there are some people that are going to get the opportunities to have jobs that maybe traditionally wouldn't have the opportunity to have those. Some of those are women. Now we know that, a lot of immigrant women had worked in the factories, but now some other women are going to get some opportunities to work in the factories that maybe just wanted to have a job, have some economic freedom, have some experiences. But the bigger thing here is that your African American population, that minority population that has traditionally been discriminated against and not been able to get those jobs, are now going to be able to get those jobs, right? We've talked about in the past, African Americans post-Civil War are traditionally going to live in the South on the same land that they had worked, previously as slaves, and now their parents or grandparents had worked as slaves, because no one in the North would hire them. So they were stuck in the South, really having no ability to move, go anywhere else, or do anything else. Now, for the first time, they can move north, and there's job opportunities waiting for them because so many people have been sent overseas to serve in the military that those jobs have opened up. So we call this our Great Migration. This means that our demographics in our cities are massively changing. When you look at our big cities today, our urban cities, and you see large minority populations that include African Americans, this is where those patterns begin. This is where our big cities start to have large Black populations. And so especially as we head into the 1920s, we'll talk about what that means for our cities. My little one is melting down, so I'm going to cut this video short and try to get her the heck out of my office so that I can do another video for you guys and wrap up World War I. All right, so I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.